Hello, everybody, and welcome to this seminar hosted by the Deakin Science and Society Network. My name's Timothy Neal, and I'm an Associate Professor of Anthropology here at Deakin University and a stream leader with Aaron Schultz of the Environmental Challenges stream of the Deakin Science and Society Network, an interdisciplinary initiative here at the university. I'd like to begin this session first by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm coming to you, standing on this particular slice of Naarm, Melbourne, Australia, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd also like to pay my respects and acknowledge the Indigenous traditional owners of all the places that you may be listening to this seminar from. For those of you who haven't come to one of our Deakin Science and Society Network seminars before, a quick rundown of the structure for today's event, climate politics when it's too late. In a moment, I'll introduce our speaker, Associate Professor Wim Carton, who's going to give a 40-minute presentation or so, and then we'll move to some comments and conversation with our discussant, Dr. Sophie Adams, here, and then some Q&A. I'll be chairing this discussion here on Zoom, and my colleague, Karina Traits, will be moderating the YouTube live chat. And we're very keen, as always, to hear and answer your questions. So you can either post your questions in the YouTube chat, or you can send them to us on Twitter or X. We'll be having a look there as well. So without much more further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Wim Carton is an Associate Professor of Sustainability Science at Lund University, Sweden, where he works on the politics and political economy of carbon dioxide removal and carbon offsetting in all its many and various forms. He's the author of over 20 academic articles and book chapters on the subject, and the author, together with Andreas Malm, of Overshoot, How the World Surrendered to Climate Breakdown, published by Verso this year in 2024, and The Long Heat, Climate Politics When It's Too Late, also forthcoming from Verso this coming year, 2025. With Wim, our discussant today is Dr. Sophie Adams, who's a human geographer and science and technology studies scholar here at Deakin University, has a research background in climate change impacts and response. And her current research, very exciting work, is on the challenges of building renewable and resilient energy systems in a changing climate, with interests in household energy users' experiences and the ways that the social objectives and implications of renewable energy transitions are being negotiated. So I'm very grateful to both Wim and Sophie, particularly Wim, not only for his fantastic work, which I started reading a few years ago and I find so incredible, but also thank you, Wim, for getting up so early to be with us to share that work. So over to you.
Thanks, thanks so much, Tim, and very grateful to be able to present this work in progress here for you today. And it wasn't much of a bother getting up this early. I have a small baby, so I get up early these days. I'm going to see if I can start my slides here. Just a second. Can you see this? All good. Very good. So yes, my talk today is going to be a bit of a test run, I guess, because I'm going to present on some work that is not quite finished yet, and that is going to go into this book that I'm writing together with Andreas at this moment. And it's called The Long Heat, Climate Politics When It's Too Late. And I can explain a little bit about the title and maybe the subtitle later if necessary. But just to give a bit of context, so this is part of a kind of 2-volume project that is exploring the politics and political economy of overshoot, or what we call the overshoot conjuncture. So together with Andreas, I have this book coming out now in October, it's called Overshoot, which goes into the kind of history and the political economy of overshoot as a concept within the climate discussion. Obviously, overshoot has a longer discussion than that, but within the climate discussions, it kind of connotes this very specific thing, which I'm going to come back to in a second. And so we go through the kind of science and politics of that and history of it. And we set up this argument to then discuss, in a way, what is the inevitable consequence of talking about overshoot and what overshoot essentially entails, and that is that we are moving towards a situation where just talking about emission reductions is not enough, and climate politics is broadened to also encompass now everything to do with the politics of carbon dioxide removal, solar geoengineering, and then we're probably going to have a brief section on adaptation in this book as well. And so our argument essentially is going to be that we have this kind of diverging or multiplying front lines over which social struggles will need to be fought to ensure that none of these forms of climate politics are used in ways that delay rather than contribute to mitigating climate change. And to maybe very briefly explain what we mean, I don't know how many of you are kind of familiar with this whole conversation. It's in some ways, I guess, a very niche subject. Although very impactful, of course, or very important. So our starting point here is that many of the essentially all of the kind of mitigation pathways that the IPCC assesses in its assessment reports since at least 2014, since the 5th assessment report, rely on this notion of overshoot. And essentially what that means is that, we have this politically agreed upon temperature targets, 1.5 degrees. But if you look at what the models say, then none of these targets will essentially be met outright. Rather, we will first exceed these temperature targets, and then we will use technologies for removing CO2 from the atmosphere to bring temperatures down again to the right level by the end of 2100. And that's essentially the notion of overshoot. It's that we exceed and then reduce temperature targets. We exceed temperature targets and then reduce temperatures again to them. And this notion comes with a fair amount of problems. And obviously, we spend a lot of time problematizing this, particularly in the first book. Not least, of course, the fact that to be able to do this, you need a lot of these negative emission carbon removal technologies, right? So it relies, and these are graphs from the IPCC report, from the 6th assessment report. It relies on this notion, as you see here, that by the second half of this century, we go not just to net zero, but beyond that, we need to remove more CO2 out of the atmosphere than we put in. And we're talking about very, very large amounts of carbon removal. And all of that, of course, has its problems. And this is also something we address, and I'm not going to go into that so much. But, all these possible technologies for removing CO2 from the atmosphere come with their own caveats and risks and various social and economic problems as well. So in the book, in Overshoot, we essentially talk about this notion of overshoot ideology. And we argue that if you look at the history of overshoot, it's clear that it arrived into this whole conversation, into the scientific discussion as a form of capital protection. It was essentially a strategy to avoid very rapid near-term emission reductions that would entail scrapping existing investments in fossil fuels. So it's a way to maintain this very large infrastructure, this very large body of fixed capital that needs to be depreciated in order to remain profitable. Now we argue that science and science is of course a very broad category. We're talking mainly about economics, but there's other disciplines, I think, and that will become clear from the rest of my talk, that have actively contributed to this as well. They have played an active role in this capital protection. And I think this is a very kind of crucial point, and I'll come back to it as well. And this is essentially the main the gist of my talk today. Is that we talk a lot about the fossil fuel companies and how much they have known and their role in delaying climate change, but I think there's much to say for taking a closer look at the role of science, in particular renderings of climate economics, for example, and how we've delayed or justified the delay of emission reduction. And science has done that by positioning carbon removal as a way to reconcile meeting these temperature targets with avoiding these kind of what are in essence kind of revolutionary changes in society, right? This kind of large upheavals in economics, in all aspects of society, as the IPCC report itself says, right? That would be necessary if you did not have carbon dioxide removal. And that's where this notion of exceed limits first and remove later essentially comes from. It's an active capital protection strategy. So all of that is what we cover in this first book, in Overshoot. And then the second book, in a way, asks, how likely is that proposition? How likely is it that we will be able to exceed temperature targets first and then remove CO2 later to achieve them anyway? What can we expect the climate politics of the Overshoot conjuncture to actually look like? And what does this tell us about the likelihood of reversing warming? And the second book is going to be very long. We have a very extensive section on like the natural science of reversing climate change. To me, the whole notion of tipping points and the problems with this kind of the very idea of a gradual approach or a gradual reduction in temperatures, and gradualism in general, right, as a kind of very strong proposition still within climate science. But then the bulk of the book is going to be about political economy and the broader politics of it, where this kind of notion of the role of science plays in as well. And I'm going to focus on that part today, mainly because I know this is a group that's maybe particularly interested in questions of science and technology studies. So that's what I'm gonna do. So can we reverse temperatures? Of course, there's a lot of ways, methods in which you can remove CO2 from the atmosphere. This again is from the 6th assessment report. The IPCC is very clear that there are all these opportunities. They come with their own caveats, but it's not it's not a fantasy in the sense that there's many ways in which this can be done, right? From afforestation, just planting a lot of trees, to the more kind of industrial direct air capture forms of removal. I'm not going to talk about these in much detail, but I'm happy to answer questions later in case it's interesting. Now I'm going to talk about, as I said, the science, and we've decided to call this section the ideologies of the founding fathers, and essentially it's because I think it's interesting to look at the early history of removal, because in some ways you have less of the kind of trying to frame things in a politically correct way and saying the quiet parts out loud than you have at in the present moment. So I'm going to essentially take you through some of the early history of carbon removal to illustrate why we see a lot of problems with the way this is being framed. So reversibility, in order to be able to, compensate for overshoot after you've exceeded the limit, you need to be able to reverse temperatures. And this demands, and there's quite a lot of literature on this now, right, that carbon removal is used in addition to emission reductions and not as a substitute for it. And this is simply because, if we want to maintain any kind of sustainability limits and, take into account energy and water and biomass use and all of these kind of things, which is a main concern with a lot of carbon removal technologies, land use in particular. Then it's clear that there's a limited amount of carbon removal that you can do, and the more that you use to compensate, to offset essentially emission reductions, the less there will be available to actually bring temperatures down. So this is why we cannot use it as a substitute, or at least only to the extent that it compensates for these residual emissions that are often talked about. And this notion of using it as a substitute is, of course, often framed in terms of mitigation deterrence or moral hazards. Essentially, the idea that rather than using it as an addition, there's all kinds of ways in which it might deter emission reductions. And my entry point here is that this is often framed as a risk. Mitigation deterrence is often discussed as something that is a hypothetical concern, something that might emerge in the future. It's something that, because it's framed as a risk, is seen as something that can be governed in a way, managed with fairly limited changes in the way policy operates and so on. And I would argue that framing it as a risk and as something that is hypothetical seriously underestimates the nature and the extent of the problem, and that we'd rather need to see it as a structural characteristic of fossil capital, of or fossil fuel-based economy. And I would argue actually that we see something very similar with solar geoengineering, right? I'm not going to talk about this here. It's also part of the book. But we see very much the same kind of dynamics playing out there. And so what I want to convince you of today here in my talk is that carbon removal has always been envisioned as an alternative to emission reductions. From its very beginning, from the moment it was being conceived by scientists and the moment it was taken up in policy and in government reports, this was one of the main ways in which it was being framed. Either permanently as a permanent substitute for fossil fuels, for emission reductions, or as just a temporary measure, as a stopgap to buy time. And I think we really need to take seriously this history and the extent to which it, continues into the present if we want to. If we are serious about using carbon removal in a way that actually can reverse temperatures. So I'm gonna take you through quite a few of these founding fathers of the carbon removal discussion, essentially, and give some examples of the way that substitution actually is a core part of this. So I ask you to bear with me while I talk you through some of this. Hopefully it is interesting. So the first person I want to talk about is this scientist called Freeman Dyson. He was the first person in the 70s to essentially propose the idea that we could plant a lot of trees to compensate for continuing emissions. So he writes here, the carbon dioxide generated by burning fossil fuels can theoretically be controlled by growing trees. Now, Dyson is interesting for many reasons. He had a lot of very fancy ideas. But essentially, it illustrates this kind of stopgap approach to carbon removal that seemed to be quite common in the 70s and 80s, particularly with tree planting. So he says here, for example, that it seems inevitable that we will continue for many decades to burn fossil fuels and to increase the level of atmospheric CO2. Because of that, might we have some kind of emergency measure that we could use to kind of dampen the problem while we work on alternatives. And the proposal he makes is that yes, we can just plant a lot of fast-growing trees. And this would absorb the excess of CO2 and bring the annual increase in emissions to a halt. He does acknowledge that this is only a short-term measure, right? He writes here at the very end, the long-term response should be to stop burning fossil fuels and convert our industry to renewable photosynthetic fuels, et cetera, but a worldwide shift to non-fossil fuels could not be carried out in a few years. So there's no prospect of doing that in the near term, and therefore we need to do something else. Another person that was very influential in this kind of tree planting debates was Greg Marland, here in a report to the United States Department of Energy, where he articulates, and he actually published with Dyson a bit, where he articulates very similar kind of notion, right? So he says, for example, for the nearer term, we must inquire if there's some way to prevent further CO2 buildup without shutting down the global economic system. And such a transient means to reverse or halt CO2 increase would again be tree planting. He talks about perhaps decades before the world puts in place an energy system that did not rely on fossil fuels. Now, obviously, in the 80s, there wasn't all that much happening to actually put such a system in place. Then we have a man called John Martin. John Martin was the kind of infamous originator of the idea of iron fertilization. Martin had this insight that if you looked at the the way the ice ages had developed and so on, that the oceans played a pretty significant role in this. And this was because he hypothesized these blooms in phytoplankton that removed massive amounts of CO2 from the air, and in doing so, pulled temperatures down as well. And Martin speculated that the reason why, because he looked at the oceans, he was an oceanographer, and he saw that some regions of the ocean were much more abundant in phytoplankton than others, even in places where you would expect that there would be quite a lot of it. And he speculated that the abundance of phytoplankton was at least in part controlled by the availability of micronutrients, and particularly iron. So the deficiency of iron led to a lack of phytoplankton, and therefore an opportunity. If you added iron to the ocean, you would create a bloom in phytoplankton. The phytoplankton would remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and in that way help lower temperatures. And Martin was infamous for having made the quip at a seminar that he said, "Give me a tanker full of iron and I will give you the next ice age." Now, Martin published on this very briefly. He died very shortly after his first studies on this were published. But he carried out these experiments that essentially show that it is true that if you put a lot of iron in the ocean, you create these massive phytoplankton blooms. What has remained much less clear since then is how much of that phytoplankton and the carbon that is sequestered actually is sequestered permanently, and this is of course the main problem. But I think what's interesting here is in Martin's framing of this is that he talks about these models that indicate that if fertilization were used, it would have to be carried out until fossil fuel emissions were drastically reduced, and that would be on the magnitude of hundreds of years, right? So I mean, not necessarily that Martin himself ascribed to this, even though he, made some remarks in other places that illustrated that he too was kind of pessimistic about the potential for reducing CO2 or fossil fuel emission in the near term. But that at least the models that these people were working with at the time had this kind of massive timescales for actually phasing out emissions. Another influential person in this, again from the early 90s, is Walter Seifried. Walter Seifried is one of the first persons to have proposed the idea of enhanced weathering. So essentially, if you grind certain kinds of rock, they will react with CO2 in the atmosphere and then bind the CO2 to them. And then if you dispose of those rocks, you essentially are able to, create a permanent form of carbon removal. And Seifried was, notably notably in favor of keeping the fossil fuel economy going in a way. So he argued, for example, that the next century mankind needs the energy from the fossil fuels. But obviously, if you do that without doing anything about the emissions, then that would lead to strong greenhouse gas effects. And therefore, it would be advantageous to find ways in which that CO2 can be bound. Now, in this particular paper, he talks about CO2 management more broadly. There's other papers as well where, he makes similar arguments. In this one, for example, he says, these figures show that it makes sense to use fossil fuels in a climate neutral way. And that, if we apply some of these technologies and use them, then the carbon dioxide induced greenhouse problem must not necessarily mean the end of the fossil fuel era. This is from his very first paper on enhanced weathering, this what he calls CO2 disposal by means of silicates, where he, hints at some of these similar arguments, right? If fossil fuels are to be used on a massive scale, then we need to find a way of doing it in a climate neutral way, and then enhanced weathering, the removal by minerals would be one way of doing that. Then, of course, we have everybody's famous economist, William Nordhaus, who very early on, made some of these substitution arguments from a purely economic perspective, of course. And of course, Nordhaus is interesting here, not because of, or not just because of what he says, but also because of how enormously influential he has been in the climate conversation and in climate economics in general, of course. I don't think I need to introduce him. And Nordhaus actually is even earlier than Dyson. He's one of the people who put this tree planting idea on the map in, I think it was 1975. He already published a paper on this. But this paper is a bit entertaining because he basically, talks through the various options for dealing with climate, the climate problem here. And this is from 1991. And he writes, in approaching a task, my grandfather always advised me, use brains, not brawn. The preventive strategies of planting hundreds of billions of trees or reducing fossil fuel use through trillions of dollars of investments represent the brawn philosophy. Now, obviously, if you're a cost-optimizing economist, that's not what you want to do, obviously. A promising alternative would be to treat the greenhouse warming problem with climate engineering, essentially, and that would be the equivalent of using our brains, the global equivalent of turning on an air conditioning. Potential approaches are changing the albedo reflectivity of the Earth, increasing the rate of removal of greenhouse gases, or changing the circulation of water to cool the Earth. And then, of course, and this is what he continued to do in future papers as well, including the year after in 1992 in a paper for Science, where he essentially argues that geoengineering is vastly economically superior from a cost optimization perspective than any of the other climate policy options on the table. And of course, this kind of reasoning, I think, underpins the whole history of, I mean, not just the approach to carbon removal, but the whole climate policy history. One of the most, I would say, influential people, especially when it comes to direct air capture, is Klaus Lackner, who started working at the Los Alamos laboratories with a few colleagues. And they published a number of papers to begin with, also on this notion of, binding carbon to minerals. And what's interesting in these papers is that it was very explicitly framed, this is probably the most explicit argument you will find, as a way to keep fossil fuels within the energy mix for the long term, right? So already the title says a lot, keeping coal competitive. But so they write very explicitly in this abstract, for example, the purpose of this technology is to maintain coal energy competitive, even when in the future environmental and political pressures will require a drastic reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. In contrast to most other sequestration methods, ours is not aiming at a partial solution of the problem, so they're not just trying to buy time. They are instead trying to obtain a complete and economic solution of the problem and thus maintain access to the vast fossil energy reservoir. Such a technology will guarantee energy availability for many centuries, even if world economic growth exceeds the most optimistic estimates. And they go on in this paper to kind of, elaborate this argument. I mean, it illustrates many of the dynamics that one sees later within the whole overshoot conversation, actually, that we document in the 2010s and so on, that, this technology was proposed as a way to stave off the severe economic repercussions that would happen if you would try and actually cut CO2 emissions. They're talking about the order of trillions of dollars in power plants and mining infrastructure that would be at risk if you would try and phase fossil fuels out and do something about climate change that way. And how carbon dioxide disposal would provide an insurance against those risks. They talk about renewable energy resources as kind of a complementary approach to this. So, you would have both essentially, with fossil fuels, obviously a major component if you take their word for it. And in other parts of this paper, they're also very clear that, the main risk they see is not necessarily from climate change as such, but from the social demand for action. And this is, of course, what capital protection in many ways is all about. It's about trying to formulate an answer to the demands from social movements and governments for actually doing something about climate change. One of the people who was very clearly influenced by Klaus Lackner, David Keith, who's of course maybe better known for his work on solar geoengineering at Harvard. But so in the early, and David Keith is interesting here as well because he's of course the originator of one of the main carbon direct air capture companies that there is today. So he is the founder of Carbon Engineering, which then went on to be bought by Occidental, and they're now building this Occidental Petroleum in the US, and they're now building this 500,000 megaton direct air capture plant in the Permian Basin in Texas. This is the largest such project that there is at the moment, I think. And so in the early 2000s, Keith was also kind of investigating these kind of approaches to use fossil fuels without causing kind of emissions. He talked, for example, and what's interesting here is that he talks about the advantages of substitution in a way, right? He talks about how industrial carbon management, which, to be clear, should be seen as also including kind of more fossil CCS, right? How that may enable stabilization of atmospheric concentrations at acceptable cost, weaken the link between fossil energy and atmospheric CO2 emissions, and therefore make it feasible to consider a fossil-based global economy through the next century, and how that would be a very appealing thing to vested interests, of course, reducing the severity of the threat that emission reduction poses to them, and thereby perhaps even easing current deadlocks in both domestic and international abatement policy. So what happens here is that, in a way, mitigation deterrence is being framed as a virtue, right? It's not a risk. It's something that we should actually be encouraging, because it might appease vested interests who have been blocking negotiations, and by substituting emission reductions for these kind of less threatening technological approaches, we might bring them on board and thereby, actually resolve the problem. Keith and colleagues made similar arguments in other papers as well. Here they talk about weakening the link between fossil fuels and releasing greenhouse gases again. Yeah, it's in a way the same argument. Stated bluntly, if society adopts carbon management widely, existing fossil fuel dependent industry and nations may continue to operate profitably both in present energy markets and in new markets that develop around carbon management, making them more willing to tolerate policies that pursue substantial reduction of atmospheric emissions. I would argue that the history of climate denial by these industries puts this kind of suggestion in question, right? Now, what's interesting here, and this is what I want to get to a little bit here, I soon going to be finished with my examples, is that in some of these renderings of carbon removal, you also have the opposite, and the opposite being kind of an argument on the difficulty or the challenges with scaling conventional mitigation. So here, paper co-authored by Keith, for example, finds that photovoltaic, and this is from 2008, photovoltaic energy may have difficulty becoming economically competitive with other options for large-scale, low-carbon bulk electricity. And this included then CCS or coal power plants with CCS or natural gas power plants with CCS that were the kind of large-scale, low-carbon bulk electricity that they compare this with in the next 40 years. And based on this, they argue that governments should be cautious about large subsidies for deployment of present photovoltaic, I can't pronounce this word apparently, photovoltaic technology while continuing to invest in R&D. So a kind of very pessimistic approach to solar here, right? Especially because this is in 2008. They talk about 40 years. We obviously know that cost for photovoltaic, for PV, I'm just going to quote PV, have dropped considerably in the last 20 years. And this analysis has been proven entirely wrong in that way. But it's very interesting because it's very kind of representative of a broader, I would argue, mitigation pessimism in the literature. And of course, there's been a few studies in recent years that have kind of made systematic assessments of these mitigation pathways and of this kind of mitigation pathway literature and the scenarios that the IPCC and other international organizations use. That shows that they kind of across the board tend to underestimate how rapidly these renewable energy technologies have actually scaled and developed over the years. So in this paper, for example, they argued that the trend of rapid cost declines has structurally been underestimated, and this leads to underestimating the future role and level of deployment of renewable technologies, which obviously is it's not innocent. This is another paper that finds exactly the same. This is from a data set comparing actual development of solar across different regions, which are the black dotted lines here. In terms of both cumulative capacity, this is the upper part, and prices, the lower part, compared with the scenario range by one of the data sets that is encompassing a large amount of scenarios used in the IPCC. And what one sees is that across the board, the scenarios underestimate how much PV actually scales and overestimate their cost. I don't know how much time I have left. Maybe flag if I should speed up a little bit. But I'm gonna come to an end here soon. I want to just mention two further things. So obviously, we've talked about what we've called the ideologies of this, the early literature on carbon removal. This isn't the only kind of data point or point of evidence in the book, of course. We also talk quite extensively about the history of carbon offsetting, for example, and how carbon removal has always already been imagined as a carbon offset in many ways as well. The first offset projects, for example, had the explicit aim of keeping coal plants alive or even to build new ones. This, for example, is a paper from one of the representatives from Advanced Energy Services, coal utility in the United States in the early 90s. That was the very first company, essentially, to implement the carbon offsetting projects in 1988. And, it says exactly this thing. It says, since coal is such a large and potentially cost-effective energy resource, it would be highly desirable and pragmatic to preserve it as a future energy policy in future energy policies that address the global warming challenge. And the way to do that would be to preserve coal and gas options while mitigating any adverse global climate effects. We should implement CO2 emission offsets. And what they did is essentially this. They paired coal power plants with tree planting projects, in this case in Guatemala, that they then argued offset these emissions. Now, we can talk a lot about the problems with this. But just to illustrate that, we have a very kind of similar parallel conversation happening in the offsetting space. And then, of course, in the UNFCCC as well, where the main appeal of removals and sinks, carbon sinks, has always been to provide flexibility and lower cost of polluters. And this was, of course, one of the main kind of points of contention in the negotiations. This was what civil society organizations were super concerned about. And you saw that concern very clearly in that it was mainly fossil fuel producers who were most vocal about the need for, including all kinds of things. So this is from a document submitted to the UNFCCC as part of the Kyoto negotiations in the early 90s, for example. This is the position of the United States, where they argue that the inclusion of all sources and sinks in these kind of qualified emission reduction obligations will provide parties with maximum flexibility in the most practical, appropriate, and cost-effective manner. So, it's always going to be about, it has always from the start been about, cost effectiveness and etc. All right, I'm going to round up here very, very quickly. I don't know, I have a few slides left, but I'm going to take you through very quickly. First of all, these are not marginal voices in the carbon removal debate, right? We're talking about some of its main proponents, publishing in some of the most impactful scientific journals. I think the early texts say the quiet part out loud, and that's why, we think they're interesting. Obviously, the argument has morphed in some way. We talk about, the later history, particularly in Overshoot, but I would say the main tendencies remain there, and particularly the economic rationale, has not changed. It's still very dominant. But what we do see is that we've moved from buying time in the short term because it's cheapest to do so, to this notion of overshoot. We will continue in the present, and then in the future, we will use carbon removal to reverse temperatures. And that will be less expensive because of discounting and all of these other things. So there's if one would summarize what the ideological component of it here is, there's a clear, I think, argument about fossil fuel inevitabilism, at least for the medium term, in some cases much longer, evidently, as in the Lackner paper and Seyfried's as well, for example. And I would argue a kind of naivety or maybe neglect of the role of science, discourse, ideology in perpetuating this condition. I mean, stating these kind of things, it's not just an observation about the state of the world, of course. If we're serious about the notion of performativity, then this is what is being performed as well, right? It's not innocent to state on the pages of science and in government reports that fossil fuels will inevitably continue for decades and centuries. That is not an immutable law of nature, of course. It's a function of, in part, the social legitimacy that fossil fuels have, and that social legitimacy is in part a function of, what scientists argue about it in papers like this. The reason this matters, in other words, is that these arguments are performative, and as I said, it's not innocent to make these claims. What is also interesting is this notion of mitigation turns as a virtue rather than a problem, that it will appease vested interests. And I think this dynamic between mitigation pessimism versus removal optimism, right? Solar, wind, phasing out fossil fuels is seen as kind of too difficult, too costly, not reliable. We can't possibly scale it in the near term, etc. To the extent that, reality has overtaken many of these arguments. While removal technologies somehow seem eminently possible, they are to be used as a short-term stopgap measure, even on these very large scales and in very short time perspectives. So, one could argue that back in the 80s, perhaps, there really wasn't so much prospect for, moving to alternative energy sources, and hence, maybe one could be forgiven for being so pessimistic about it, but then, of course, that doesn't explain the optimism about removal technologies. And the difference, of course, is the compatibility with business as usual. Good. I would argue mitigation deterrence is a structural future of fossil capitalism, and we can expect it to stay with us all the way, and hence there will be more struggles over it. I would argue also that it's clear that scientists have been complicit in reproducing and legitimizing mitigation deterrence, and therefore we need to really take a long and hard look at how we study, conceptualize, and communicate what is or is not possible in terms of climate mitigation. Why this matters, of course, is more substitution means less compensation for overshoot, and hence, we should be very concerned about it if we're on a trajectory to exceed these targets and then somehow expect to reduce temperatures later again. And ultimately, avoiding mitigation deterrence will necessitate confronting the interests that benefit from it head on, and that means, there's no way around a fossil fuel phase out and limiting these opportunities for substitution. Sorry for going a bit fast there, but I saw Tim waving his hand, and I realized I've been going over my time a bit. So, but thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Wim. That was right on time. So we're going to have some comments and conversation between Wim and our discussant, Sophie Adams. And I'll use this as an occasion just at this moment. Those of you watching on YouTube, please do post your questions in the chat. We will get to some of them. So do please pop them in there, and we will pass them through to Wim and Sophie. So over to you, Sophie.
Thanks very much, Tim, and thanks, Wim, for a fascinating paper. I really enjoyed that. I have a lot to say and a lot I'd like to ask you about. I'm conscious of time, so I won't speak for very long, but just a couple of comments and questions from me. So your paper's really sort of underlined how climate commitments, including the 1.5 degrees temperature target and net zero targets, have become ambitious, in becoming more ambitious, have embedded within them carbon removal, and sort of hinge on the prospect of overshoot in their sort of realization. I think this is really important to be talking about because I think most people would not be aware that carbon removal is in fact assumed within these targets and net zero commitments that our governments around the world have been signing up to in recent years. So I'm struck by how much of the debate about carbon removal and mitigation deterrence comes down to how we think societal change and technological change can and should occur, and in particular whether we think carbon removal has a role to play in climate change response hinges on what we think is possible and likely in the absence of carbon removal. So this view that low carbon alternatives to the present fossil fuel based regime are politically, economically and socially unviable. And that if we don't turn to carbon removal technologies, we're facing inevitable catastrophic climate change is what these proponents who you've introduced us to of carbon removal are sort of prosecuting. It's interesting that sort of some of the ideas about the way the world works and the way that change in the world occurs, running through all these debates, that there's a kind of a very strange sort of paradox in a sense that you pointed to between, on the one hand, mitigation pessimism, which sort of suggests that we couldn't possibly alter our society's reliance on fossil fuels, or at least not anytime soon, and on the other hand, and in stark contrast, this optimism and confidence in the potential to manage our way out of the climate problem. And there seems to be this sort of strange, sort of fragmented idea about the way that we can affect change in the world. On the one hand, deploying carbon removal technologies are portrayed as straightforward as turning on an air conditioner, in the words of Nordhaus, I think it was. One of the direct air capture startups is even called global thermostat, suggesting that we can just calibrate the temperature of the planet as straightforwardly as turning a thermostat up and down. And these technologies can proceed unhindered by any of the political and social and other challenges that have plagued emissions reductions. Conventional mitigation efforts are presented as virtually impossible in this logic because they would require political intervention. So it's a strange construction of kind of our agency to engage with these challenges, which of course, as you've shown us, is strategically deployed to sort of support business as usual. But I point this out because I think we see this ambivalence about human agency in other areas of climate politics, and I've thought about this a little bit in some of my previous work on climate change adaptation, where the Earth itself figures as something to be calibrated and managed, and is indeed manageable, and yet at the same time we tend to sort of, people are written out of the role of the manager through a sort of implicit denial of agency and politics. But anyway, turning now to something I'd like to ask you to speak to us more about, and that is the active role that science has played in establishing carbon removal as a necessary element of climate change response, which, as you mentioned earlier, is of particular interest to us here in the Science and Society Network. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about how it is that that science has come to establish carbon removal as necessary, but also what does this mean for how we ought to think about the policy relevance of science, and in particular, the idea that climate science needs to be policy relevant. Where do we go from here with this idea? Do we need to rethink that? And in particular, the collaboration of scientists and policymakers that was envisaged in the design of the IPCC. So that's one question. And another is that, as you've suggested, the promise of carbon removal has been framed by its proponents as a way of overcoming stalemate in international climate politics. And indeed, it has helped to get us to a 1.5 degree target in Paris in 2015, which is, of course, really important to some parties, such as the small island developing states and the least developed country group. And it has contributed to this wave of net zero commitments. So how do we think about ambition and kind of the role of consensus in ambition, I suppose? How do we, and should we even be trying to harness something of the sense of commitment and common ambition that accompanies these targets, or would you say that this sense of common ambition in kind of masking the sort of fossil fuel interests that have contributed to getting us here is actually sort of it is a danger here. So that's my second question. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Sophie. So there's lots to talk about there, of course, and I by no means have even kind of half-complete answers to this. They're, of course, very big subjects, and yeah, they're really touch on the crux of the matter, of course. I think you're right that, I mean, in many ways, all of this hinges on what me and a few colleagues have been discussing lately in terms of some form of the politics of possibility, right? There's an enormous politicization happening of what is possible and impossible in terms of climate mitigation. And I think these are different, iterations of that conversation. It's in a way very kind of political and normative to argue that you can mitigate climate change without carbon removal, because I mean that would require very kind of far-reaching changes, and there's people arguing that's not possible, and then on the other hand there's the carbon removal equivalent of that. So I do think that's where all of this kind of comes down to, in a way, and it's about how do we grapple with that, right? Now on your two questions, I mean, I like this. There's been this critique of the kind of modeling where I think some of these questions about policy relevance and the role of policy relevance come out kind of most explicitly. The role of integrated assessment models in the climate conversation, and then obviously the massive influence they have had within the IPCC, but also then of course beyond that. I think I don't remember the name, but there's two scholars that have turned around the phrase evidence-based policy making and argued that, you know, essentially what we're seeing with these models, because of all the normative assumptions that are sneaking into them, and then the way they are being presented as you know, objective, and the way that is then fed off to policymakers, is a form of evidence, of policy-based evidence making, essentially. And I like that notion, because I think if you look at the history of how you know, the IEMs have set up the 2-degree target, and then attempts to kind of appease both the I mean, I guess the climate ambition of government, which of course in many ways is sincere, at least in its most abstract form, but then hold on to this, you know, fundamental notion of cost effectiveness and optimal pathways, and you know, which is where I think the problem really is, right? It's this kind of embedded assumption that we cannot go beyond the kind of foundations of neoclassical economic or neoliberal economics even. And when you combine those two, you end up with an overshoot pathway, and that's exactly what has happened, right? And this is what we narrate in the first book as well. So where do we go from here? I mean, I would really argue that you know, in a situation where governments are you know, not doing enough, and where, you know, policies are super problematic, and where there's a lot of incentives from scientists to kind of adjust the way they frame things and the things they work on, and all of these kind of things in line with what policymakers already want to hear. And of course, there's a lot of literature on this within STS. Then I think you end up in the situation where, in one way or another, you're kind of justifying this kind of inadequate policy response. So I personally would like to see a much stronger move away from trying to be policy relevant to, you know, trying to, you know, really take a stand somehow for more radical pathways. And of course, there are people, there's a lot happening in that space, right? I mean, the latest IPCC report encompasses some of these kind of more radical approaches. So there's definitely people doing this. I guess the critique to that would be, but then, you know, scientists would fall on deaf ears, and policymakers certainly wouldn't listen, but they're not listening now, I would argue. So, I mean, it's like, we might as well be sincere rather. But it's a super difficult question, right? I mean, it touches on so many things, the way the whole kind of scientific enterprise is structured these days with, you know, grants and where those grants come from. I mean, you can bring in the political economy of it as well. Yeah, that was probably not a very coherent answer to your question, but those were some of my thoughts. How do we think about ambition and common ambition? I mean, so this is something we really struggle with in this book, because obviously the 1.5 target is valuable in itself, right? And as you say, it has really come from, I mean, it was a demand developed by articulated by developing countries and the environmental movement, almost entirely against the will of developed countries and vested interests. So I mean, it was a big victory for the environmental movement and for the global South. But it was co-opted almost entirely then very quickly by, you know, becoming reliant on these overshoot pathways, right? So I think it's I don't know if I have a really good answer to this. I mean, the thing is, the last 12 months, right, we've seen temperatures exceed 1.5 degrees for I think every single month in a row. Obviously, that doesn't mean we've exceeded 1.5 degrees statistically speaking, but at least we're very clearly on the way. So at this point in time, to argue that 1.5 degrees is still possible also requires a leap of faith in many ways, right? I mean, it's extraordinary what would need to happen without relying on carbon removal to stay within those targets. So in that sense, we're trying to be kind of ambivalent about this in the book, but because our point is not about the 1.5-degree target, it's about targets that are not really targets in the first place because you allow them to be exceeded. But I don't know. I don't know if I formulated a really good thought about this for myself. There's obviously a lot of people that are critical of this target setting as a kind of way of moving policy forward in itself. I do think they have, I mean, the 1.5-degree target has helped mobilize a lot of good things as well. It just that I think the problem is when you try and appease kind of vested interest and you think that bringing those into the conversation is somehow going to help the conversation, you end up watering it down. And I think that's the problem with, I guess, a common ambition. Yeah. I mean, all of this comes down to the need for more regulation in a way, right? I mean, the way that corporations are going about formulating these targets is super problematic. So I don't know if you can have a kind of common target that will not in some way or another be misused, but no clear answers maybe from my side.
We've got a couple of questions, including one from Aaron Schultz, our SSN stream leader, and I have a version of this that I also want to add to. So I'm going to read Aaron's question and then add a little thing, which is, here's Aaron. Aaron, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I can. Thanks, Tim. And so, yeah, again, thank you, Wim, for a really fascinating seminar that you presented and really insightful. And I suppose being here in Australia, our policies are a bit different to what's been happening in a lot of Scandinavian countries with renewables and policies in regards to trying to offset or even reduce CO2 emissions. So I'm just hoping you can provide some insights and some sort of recommendations on how, in a country that is so reliant on fossil fuels for energy production, but also the economic benefits that we get with exporting, what are some positive strategies that we can actually use as researchers or scientists and even sort of the general population to try and educate politicians and industries that action is required to reduce CO2 levels?
That's a difficult question. I mean, it's like, sorry, can you repeat the last part again?
I suppose it's just, trying to find strategies, or whether there's been strategies already used overseas in Europe that have been beneficial in engaging with politicians and industry with trying to educate those parties on sort of the importance of being able to find these other strategies in reducing our CO2 emissions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I know of good examples to kind of engage politicians and educate them in that way. I mean, to be very honest, there's so much information out there and so much examples of, how, I mean, one can, scale to an almost 100% renewable energy economy. This is, I guess there's some examples to be found in, I don't know, I mean, even in the US, right, in California, for example, where, real things are happening, just not maybe to the extent necessary. But I would say that, if as a politician, you're not listening, you don't want to listen somehow. So I'm not sure I'm not sure communication strategies is what's going to resolve it. It's about, I mean, you need different politicians, I guess.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? I think something that came through really strongly in your presentation, Wim, and in your work elsewhere is that the positive narrative is on the side of the negative emissions technologies, as much as they may not be feasible or implementable. They've got the positive affect and feeling, and whether or not there's some way to counter that apart from undermining it.
Yeah.
It may not be. Which goes to another question that maybe I'll add it on here, a question we got on the YouTube from Oscar Strensom, which is about, do you think the kind of various offsetting mechanisms, the negative emissions technologies, should have some role in the transition? And if so, under what kinds of conditions?
Yeah. So maybe before I touch on the offsetting question, I mean, a way to counter the kind of mitigation pessimism is, I mean, there's so much great work being done on Mark Jacobson's work, for example, is very interesting in that sense, and showing how entirely possible it is at this moment in time to have a 100% renewable energy economy, and all the advantages that would have, even without relying on nuclear, and even without relying on biomass, and even without relying on hydropower. There's just so much you could do, right? So I mean, there's a lot of it is a lot of very kind of optimistic framings of mitigation out there as well, of course, just not in the kind of yeah. I would say, especially in this literature that we've looked at, there's an overly pessimistic view. On offsetting, I mean, I would very strongly argue that there is no role for offsetting in any kind of ambitious climate policy, and the reason is, and you know, there's obviously the last few years we've seen multiple examples of this. Is offsetting for the most part hasn't worked. I mean, it has you know, not delivered the emission reductions or removals that it was promised. I can recommend Danny Cullenward and David Victor's book, Making Climate Policy Work, on this, where they clearly show that, you know, there's political structural reasons for why offsetting is never going to be working, and the reason is that it's not meant to reduce emissions. It's meant to provide flexibility for polluters and minimize costs. And so there's always going to be an incentive to look for shortcuts and ways out of whatever way the market is being designed. And I think we've very clearly seen that with both the official carbon market under the UN and with the voluntary market. And I'm afraid with the way that removals are increasingly being positioned as the next kind of form of offsetting, and that being the main way in which removals are going to be scaled, that we're going to see a repetition of the same kind of mistakes and errors. There's already, I mean, the whole history of iron fertilization after John Martin is super interesting, because it's like a few of these carbon offsetting entrepreneurs that just ran away with the idea in total denial of all the scientific uncertainties and risks with it. And you've seen that in so many of these methods where, seaweed cultivation, for example, being promoted already as an offset now, while it's, totally contested what happens when you dump seaweed in the ocean and how permanent that is and what that does to the ecosystem. So I can not really see any really good reason to keep offsetting as part of the policy mix. It's going to undermine ambition whatever way you do it, I think.
All right. Okay. We've only got a couple of minutes left. So we might have to leave it there rather than go down another question rabbit hole. But I'd like to thank Wim Carton, our speaker, and Sophie Adams for their outstanding contributions to this seminar. Thank you so much. Those of you who have been watching and watch later, do look up Wim and Andres Malm's current book, Overshoot, and look out for their forthcoming book, The Long Heat. I believe it'll be with us early next year. Is that right, Wim?
Yes, and Overshoot is not actually out yet either. It will be out in October.
I ordered it and I wondered why it hadn't come to my doorstep. So that's probably why.
It'll be released the 1st of October.
All right, 1st of October, put it in our diaries. So I'd like to thank Wim and Sophie and fellow stream leader Aaron Schultz and Karina Traits, the Deacon Science Society Network's coordinator. As a closing note, those of you who enjoyed the seminar, please do look for and register for our annual event, the Emerging Issues in Science and Society. This year's theme is on the futures of work, and it will be held in person at Deakin Downtown on Friday, June the 14th. Features a keynote on feminist futures of work by the Professor Pael Aurora from Utrecht University. It will be, as always, a great event, and so please do come along. But for now, that's it from us, and thanks everybody.